Concept Video 3, Language and Meaning, Part 2. All right, so in this video, we're going to be looking again at the last characteristic of language, which is that it changes over time. We are then going to look at sociolinguistics, which has to do with language and meaning. And then we're going to look at sociolinguistics and the three norms of that, as well as verbal styles. All right, so language changes over time. So what this means is that new words are often or constantly being invented, and existing words are no longer used and are given new meanings. So the reason this is important is because effective communicators recognize this, and they, if they truly want to gain shared meaning, that they're going to look at when they're constructing their verbal messages, when they're doing that message construction phase, or the message construction phase of the communication process. They're going to think a lot about what are the word choices I'm making, and how will the person in front of me that I'm communicating with, how will they take this? Will they understand it? Do they know a different meaning of this word? Or is it a word that is just no longer used and they won't know what it means? Why does it change? New phenomena calls for new words. Old things go away. Are no longer used or needed. And then also generations tend to like to change meanings over time. So here I just have a quick exam practice for you. And so you'll want to provide an example of each of these. So I want you to think of a new word that maybe can be from, just a word that I guess you would think of the last 20 years, 30 years. What's a new word that's been created? And then obsolete or unused word. What's a word that over the last 30 years, 40 years, we've kind of stopped using? And then finally, what's a word with a new meaning? Okay, so that's shifted from maybe the time that the word started to be used to what it's used for now. So pause the video, and when you're ready, click next. Okay, so here are my examples. I said selfie. The reason I bring this up is because the word selfie had to be created to describe a new phenomenon, meaning that people started taking pictures of themselves a lot, and that was an acceptable thing to do. So we had to think of a word that described that action. Okay, and then the next thing I said, an obsolete word, videotapes. So growing up, I had VHSs, or videotapes that I would have and I could watch movies. That now, if I said to my son, oh, get the videotape, he wouldn't know what I was talking about. And it really wouldn't even be relevant because we use streaming devices, which could be another maybe new word that's been invented. Then we have words that have changed meanings. And I said, cool. Like the word cool, when it was originally started to be used, it was just used for something that wasn't cold, but isn't warm. So in the middle of that, you got cool. But over the years, that's become cool. Like, oh, I like that outfit. It's really cool. So the connotations of that word has changed. So you may have lots of other ones, and there's always new words, and there's always words that are being used differently. We're going to explore that next when we look at sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistic meaning. I had this kind of as its own because everything we've just learned about language and meaning really applies to sociolinguistics. Okay, sociolinguistics, the definition of this is meaning that varies according to the norms of a culture or co-culture. So this means you have semantics, which is the meaning of a word, like the actual word itself. So that's looking more at the kind of the arbitrary meanings of the word. And then you have so that was semantics, pragmatics. Pragmatics has to do with what is the person really saying with the words they use. And then sociolinguistics has to do with how we come up with those meanings. And a lot of it has to do with the co-cultures that we're a part of. And or the major culture. So this goes back to kind of when we talked about cultural variations. Right? A cultural variation, depending on the dominant culture you're in, that's going to influence sociolinguistic meaning, but also all the smaller co-cultures you're a part of. Those will also have an influence. So misunderstandings happen when we interact with someone operating under different norms. I think about this a lot, like with my mom. I might say something to my mom, and maybe I use a word she's not familiar with. Or even my husband makes fun of me a lot because he's like, Helen, you got to stay hip. You have to know what the cool words are. Like the other day, when I was working on this slideshow, I kept asking him. I was like, hey, what's another word for cool these days? And he was like yelling all these like Gucci and lit, and like he's like, Helen, you got to stay hip, But that's how misunderstandings can happen. I could say something to my mom if she doesn't know the new words I'm using. Like at one point I taught my mom what selfie meant, right? If I said something to my mom about, oh, let's take a selfie, she probably would say, oh, what's that? And then I taught her, and now she knows what a selfie is, and she says it all the time. But another aspect of sociolinguistics is idioms. And this has to do with expressions with different meanings than the words used within them. So these are like those little sayings that we use that mean something, but if you really think about the words, they really don't make sense. So for me, and I'm going to give this example in a second, but like one that I've used before is who let the cat out of the bag. And if you didn't know the English language, especially American language, you'd probably say, what? Why do you have a cat in a bag? Right? That's what an idiom is. It means that the saying has a meaning, but if you really think about the words, they don't make sense with the meaning. Okay. So then here are the 3 norms. These are the things that we kind of go by as a culture and why we understand words and phrases the way we do. First, cultures have norms that assign meaning to specific words and combinations of words that may be different from their semantic meaning. So this is where idioms fall, right? So sometimes we say things, but the way that we use that word or that phrase is different than what it actually means. Even just like, hey, how are you? Often we are not asking how you are. Or really, like, especially if it's just someone you're passing and you don't know. You're just meaning to say like, hey, are you good? How are you good? You good? Like it's just saying. It's not really not really like asking how they are, just acknowledging their existence. Okay, then number 2, cultures develop different norms about what is appropriate to say to whom, by whom, when, and about what. Meaning, there are certain rules that we follow that, like to us, is a norm, and norms are like kind of rooted in our values. Like for me, I find it very, I find it appropriate to always say thank you and yes ma'am, no ma'am, anytime that I'm being waited on. So like if someone brings me, is waiting on my table, I'm always going to acknowledge them and say, hi, thank you, yes ma'am, no sir. Like those kinds of things, because I have been raised to think that like my co-culture, like that Southern co-culture, and even just the culture of my family, we believe that you should acknowledge people, you should be kind, you should be very polite, right? So that's a norm that my culture or co-culture believes or tries to live by, I should say. Okay, and then we have preferred verbal styles. So this differs from culture to culture depending on how direct or indirect one ought to be within the culture. So this has a lot to do again with those cultural variations. We're taught throughout our past experiences. We're kind of taught if we should be direct or indirect, and a lot of times, especially our co-cultures, really influence that. Like dominant culture of America, technically we would be a direct verbal style, like you say what you mean, right? But when we really think about it, we're kind of, a lot of us are indirect, and that's why misunderstandings happen. Like for me, I'm part of I identify as a female, or so the female gender. So a lot of times I was kind of taught to be indirect with my speech growing up, kind of like the example of if my husband says, hey, is everything okay? And I'm still mad. Sometimes my tendency is to want to go, I'm fine, when I'm not fine. That is indirect verbal style and also poor communication. And that's not what we want to do. We don't want to be abstract with our language. We want to be very concrete. Or at least that's what effective communicators want. But a lot of times we'll use indirect verbal style, like kind of like beating around the bush, so to say. See, that would be an idiom. But beating around the bush to kind of mask our intentions. So direct verbal style is kind of when you're very upfront about your intentions. And I want to say right now, that is not being rude. That is not being abrasive. That is not being like, well, I just think this and that's not direct. Direct verbal style is saying, hey, hi, I realize that maybe I hurt your feelings and that was not my intention. I was hoping that my message would be received this way. Can you help me figure out how to say that better? That would be direct verbal style, saying exactly what you mean and your intentions. Okay, so here's a quick exam practice for you. There's 2 different kinds. So go ahead, pause the video, and when you're ready, press play. All right, so here are a few concept connections. So again, if you want to take a quick second, pause the video and press play when you're ready.